On a late night in November of 1995, a 19-year-old fast food worker named Zhang was sprinting through the dark outskirts of Beijing toward a bus stop. He had just finished a long shift near a historic district filled with old shrines and palaces. During the day, the area was packed with tourists and taxis, but at night, it became completely deserted. Missing the final bus meant being stranded until morning. As Zhang rounded the corner, he saw an elderly woman standing alone at the stop. Relieved that he hadn't missed the bus, he slowed to a walk and gave her a polite smile to reassure her. Seconds later, the headlights of Bus 375 pierced the darkness. The old woman boarded first, followed by Zhang. He paid his fare to the conductor sitting near the front, right behind the driver, and took a seat directly behind the old woman. The bus began its route, moving past the darkened historical landmarks and entering a desolate, unlit stretch of road bordered by thick woods. Exhausted, Zhang leaned back and closed his eyes. But just as he started to drift off, the bus unexpectedly ground to a halt. Confused, Zhang looked around. There were no designated stops in this empty area. Suddenly, the driver stood up and stepped out into the pitch-black night. Outside, muffled voices echoed through the darkness. Inside, the bright interior lights turned the windows into mirrors, making it nearly impossible for Zhang, the old woman, or the conductor to see what was happening outside. Zhang pressed his face against the cold glass, cupping his hands to block the glare. Through the gloom, he saw the driver talking to three figures standing by the roadside. A moment later, the driver stepped back onto the bus. Behind him walked three men dressed in pristine traditional silk robes, two in blue and one in red. The two men in blue were physically holding up the man in red, dragging him along as if he were unconscious or severely injured. His clothes were caked in mud and grime. Without a word to the driver or passengers, the two men dragged their friend past Zhang and took seats at the very back of the bus. The driver quietly resumed driving, offering no explanation. A suffocating silence filled the vehicle. Zhang felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He could feel the eyes of the three men in the back staring directly at the back of his neck. Every tiny movement behind him sent a wave of panic through his body, but he was too terrified to turn around and look. 10 excruciating minutes passed. Suddenly, the old woman in front of Zhang whirled around toward the back. Her face twisted in shock, her eyes went wide, and she began screaming. Before Zhang could process what was happening, she grabbed her heavy purse and began violently beating him over the head, yelling that he had just stolen her wallet. Zhang was utterly bewildered. The driver, wanting no part of the commotion, slammed on the brakes, opened the doors, and ordered Zhang off the bus immediately. Eager to escape the madness, Zhang offered no argument, pushed past the shouting woman, and stepped out into the night as the bus sped away. Zhang began walking down the road toward a nearby residential area when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around, expecting the worst, and saw the old woman walking toward him. But her face was no longer filled with rage. She looked apologetic and deeply relieved. She walked up to Zhang and whispered that she needed to tell him a secret. She explained that when she had looked back earlier, she saw that the men in blue were not human. Their faces were terrifying, and they were glaring at Zhang with pure malice. Instinctively, she knew they were evil spirits intended to harm him. Desperate to save his life, she fabricated the story about the stolen wallet to force the driver to kick him off the bus. Zhang was stunned and skeptical, but he thanked her, and they parted ways. 3 days later, the news broke. Bus 375 had completely vanished that night. It was finally discovered submerged in a reservoir 60 miles away. Inside the wreckage, authorities recovered 3 bodies: the driver, the conductor, and the man in the red robe. Strangely, the 2 men in blue were nowhere to be found. Even more unsettling, medical examiners declared that while the 3 victims had died from broken necks during the crash, their bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition, as if they had been dead for several months before the bus ever crashed. To this day, locals warn travelers never to take the final ride on Route 375. Years earlier, on a crisp fall afternoon in 1887, a ranch hand named Gene Wilson was herding cattle on horseback along the Platte River near Casper, Wyoming. His faithful dog ran alongside him, nipping at the cow's heels. It was a beautiful day, but Gene was exhausted after working relentless hours. All he could think about was finishing his work and returning to the secluded valley home he shared with his wife, who was his absolute best friend. As he rode along, Gene noticed his dog was no longer by his side. Looking toward the river, he saw a thick, unnatural blanket of mist rolling over the water. His dog was standing at the river's edge, barking frantically into the fog. Gene turned his horse to investigate, but as they drew closer, the horse panicked. It whinnied, reared up on its hind legs, and nearly threw Gene to the ground. Sensing something terribly wrong, Gene dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby tree. He walked up beside his dog, who instantly fell silent, staring intently into the dense mist. Suddenly, the fog parted. Drifting silently down the shallow Platte River was an enormous, three-masted wooden ship. Gene stared in disbelief. The river was far too shallow for a vessel of that size to navigate, yet there it was, moving smoothly through the water. On the deck, Gene counted 9 sailors working in unison around a large canvas tarp. Suddenly, all 9 sailors froze. At the exact same moment, they turned their heads and stared directly at Gene. A chill ran down Gene's spine. The sailors then reached down, grabbed the edges of the tarp, and pulled it back to reveal what lay beneath. At first, Gene could only make out a dark, charred shape resting on the deck. But as he stared closer, horror washed over him. The burned, lifeless figure lying on the ship's deck was his wife. Terrified and overwhelmed by panic, Gene grabbed his dog, mounted his horse, and abandoned the cattle. He galloped at full speed toward his home, trying to convince himself that what he had seen was merely an impossible hallucination. An hour later, he crested the final hill overlooking his valley. But the quaint home he loved was gone. In its place was a smoldering pile of black ruins. Gene rushed down the hill into the wreckage. Lying on the ground near the burned remains of the house was a charred body, the exact same sight he had witnessed on the deck of the ghost ship hours earlier. His wife had perished in a house fire while he was away. Devastated, Gene shared his impossible story with anyone who would listen. Years later, his account caught the attention of Vincent Gaddis, a journalist famous for researching the mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle. Gaddis investigated the claim and confirmed that no ship of that size could have ever sailed the shallow waters of the Platte River, nor were there any historical records of such a vessel. Gaddis initially concluded that Gene's story was a delusion created by overwhelming grief and guilt. However, years later, Gaddis uncovered 2 other historical reports from the same region, one from 25 years before Gene's encounter and another 16 years after. In both instances, different individuals reported seeing an impossibly massive wooden ship drifting through the fog on the Platte River, with a crew of phantom sailors pulling back a tarp to reveal a premonition of their loved one's impending death.